Therapists that have cried in a session, why? I cried when I had to say goodbye to a client of mine who was dying in hospital. We had worked through some pretty challenging things together and he had a huge impact on me and I felt it was important for him to see that in my tears and words as I said goodbye. Not during the session, but I wanted to. I had a teenage client who asked me to listen to their life story, part of the 12-step program they were in. They didn't want me to correct the grammar, just to tell them if it made sense. It started off with, the first time I did drugs I was 9 years old when my mom and her boyfriend injected me with black tar heroin. I listened patiently and as soon as we were finished and they left I cried bitter tears at how cruel people can be. I heard years later that the client was doing terribly, was a prostitute, and a heavy drug user. Sometimes this field is like staring into the abyss of human suffering. My patient cried and said, "There's nobody on this planet who loves me anymore." I cried when I left because I knew she was right. For context, she was 95, her husband and son had died, she had a personality disorder that made her behavior unbearable for her environment after her husband died and every person still in her life were paid for to be around her. She died a few months after this conversation. Had a sweet little boy tell me about the death of his dad, who was his little league coach, tragically died the week of the big championship game. He went ahead and played the game the day before the funeral. He hit a home run and shared tearfully how the next day, he put the baseball in his dad's coffin at the funeral, with his team all standing around him in support. Hell, now I'm crying again. I was a high school teacher and was called to counsel so many times. One time one of my students, 13 female, was sexually assaulted by an adult male the night before, and her friend told me. I had to call the police, mandated reporter, and the school called mom. Mom showed up and basically told her daughter she was a slut, this was her very first sexual experience, and abandoned her. I went with her to the police station to file the report, and was in the room for the physical exam. They don't teach you these things in teacher school. My heart broke for her and I was a mess that night and day after. How could a parent do that to a child? I was sitting with someone struggling with alcohol who couldn't get clean at the same time my very best friend in the entire world was dying because of alcohol. I couldn't get to him because it was the beginning of COVID and it was tearing me up. But I went to work anyway, which was fine except for this one person. I had to stop the session, explain a bit, and then went back to her. The grief just sort of caught me off guard. Therapist here. I've gotten misty-eyed a number of times, but only outright had tears fall once. My client was very vividly describing the week her newborn daughter spent in the NICU, ending with the day that they knew she would pass. She told me what it was like to hold her baby as she died in her arms. The feeling of grief that filled the air was just too much for me to hold in, so of course a few quiet tears rolled out of my eyes. I was doing a cognitive assessment for a girl. We were doing tests and at one point she started crying. She was unable to tell me why, she was fine just one moment before. I let her collect her thoughts, then she said softly, "I don't want to be more stupid than my friends." She wasn't actually, she was very bright, but she didn't know that she has dyslexia, dysorthography and dyscalculia. I realized that she went through 13 years of school without help. Her parents didn't want to do an assessment as they thought she was just lazy. I told her that she was very brave to decide to get help and things would get better after our assessment and I felt tears in my eyes. As a fellow parent whose kid died, these are the only situations where I find it therapeutically beneficial to the client to 1. Disclose and 2. Cry when it feels natural. I cried in a substance treatment group. A client's mom had reached out via email to me to say that her daughter died from an OD. She called during my group so I chose to take the call and spoke with her briefly. I thought I could continue with the group. Ended up in tears instead. I cried after I worked with a kid who described an emotionally difficult situation with a sibling. The kid's experience aligned very similarly to something I went through with my own sibling when I was the kid's age and I hadn't realized how much hurt I was carrying from the experience. Being a therapist sometimes means being confronted with things you didn't realize had such a strong impact on you. Luckily, I have a stellar therapist of my own that I can work through these moments with. I was working with a deeply depressed client who had a lot of negative self-talk about how she was always a failure. We were exploring the origins of this and how young she was the first time she felt self-blame. She told me her earliest story of when she was in 2nd grade. Afterwards, as we were processing it, I expressed that it wasn't your fault about the story. She just broke down sobbing and said nobody has ever said that to me before in between sobs. It hit me and I cried a little. Hearing that a client's entire life is trauma after trauma. That client also described it in graphic detail. I've experienced the same thing with clients who have changed their lives and are ready to leave rehab. All part of the process. My therapist cried a little when I told her that seeing her was nearly the only thing I always look forward to. Honestly, when a client had made such significant improvements that they were in disbelief that they were in the position they were in, which was 100x better than when they accessed support. Luckily it was a phone session so they didn't know. In 3.5 years, the only time my therapist cried was when I handed her the typed and detailed account of my trauma from my ex. We had not discussed it in full-fledged detail before because I couldn't verbalize it. And it about broke me when she cried because no one in my life had ever cared that much. Counselor here. I haven't outright cried, but I have gotten misty-eyed a few times. That's almost crying, right? We are human also. And if the opportunity presents itself, I usually call myself out and use it as a rapport-building statement. As you were telling your story, I was very moved. And that's just from hearing it. I can't imagine what it must have been like to live through it. My boyfriend is a therapist, and some days, he offers teletherapy. We both have home offices, so I don't see or hear his sessions. Confidentiality is very seriously protected. But one day, he came out of his office several minutes late, with tears in his eyes, and it was obvious he had been crying. I really wish I could ask him. But I just gave him a hug and went back into my office. Not a therapist, but I work in patient psych. I've only cried once in the room with a patient. They were having a very visceral, sobbing breakdown. I had taken care of them for quite some time and I cared a lot. Their pain was just so raw in that moment I couldn't help it. Just begging to die and saying horrible things. I was able to hide it and comfort them, but it was a hard moment. Many more times I've been able to hold in the tears till I'm home, or at least till I can hide in the bathroom. Client who lost her husband talking about how due to a miscommunication at the hospital she thought she'd have time to say goodbye before he passed away, taken off ventilator, but when she came back into the room he had died and she wasn't there for him dying. Everyone got to say goodbye except her. She loved him so much and it totally broke my heart. All of her story was so sad, so this was icing on the cake really.